Hello, this is Brandon. I apologize in advance. I've had bronchitis for about a week, so I'm likely going to be a little out of breath while I'm doing this. But I'm conducting my student-led lecture on Coleman Kocher's 2011 article, Detention, Deportation, Devolution, and Immigrant Incapacitation in the U.S. post 9/11. In this article, Coleman and Kocher argue that in the legal system post 9/11, quote, the externally oriented territoriality of U.S. immigration enforcement practice has been supplemented with a management of population strategy focused not on stopping territorial entry per se, but on policing immigrants who have already settled in the US. The authors begin by identifying the popular imagination of what immigration and border control in the US looks like. They describe a kind of unregulated, lawless territory replete with unrestricted movement of people across borders. This is, they note, in contrast to the always increasing complexity of border infrastructure and militarization of border control. They note that these popular narratives of lawlessness serve the ideological function of justifying stricter enforcement, and in fact point out the malleability of the American border rather than its, quote, concreteness. The state's response to the 9/11 attacks included a, quote, significant escalation in interior immigration enforcement, exemplified by the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and what the authors describe as the, quote, suturing of immigration policy to Homeland Security. That is to say, Homeland Security is now seen as requiring immigration enforcement. The authors use the term devolution in their article not to refer to a lightening of immigration enforcement or return to old policy, but rather to the delegation of immigration enforcement to state and local police. The enforcement is devolving, that is, moving backwards or down to smaller, more localized legal bodies. Historically, immigration control has been the purview of the federal government, which decided how many people from where could immigrate how often and for what reasons. Section 287G of the Immigration and Nationality Act, added in 1996, explicitly allows for this deputization, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, actively invites lower policing bodies to collaborate on enforcement, as illustrated by the screenshot of their site I've included. We are reminded that, quote, 287G is far from a uniform delegation of power, and that the ways in which these delegations and collaborations manifest are always, quote, conditioned by site-specific legal and political contexts. The goal of this collaboration is not equal and just enforcement of immigration law, but rather the increased capacity of the federal government to control and contain immigrant populations, such that, quote, non-federal custody cases resulting in detention and deportation are now a cornerstone of overall U.S. immigration strategy. Coleman and Kocher outline the, quote, de-juridicalization of immigration enforcement via such measures as expedited removal, created in 1996 to allow summary deportation of individuals within 100 miles of the US-Mexico and US-Canada borders. Under 287G, there is, quote, no formal requirement for successful criminal prosecution in order for the deportation process to kick in. Therefore, people may now be deported as criminals without having been tried or convicted in the criminal law system. Local law enforcement may even keep holding individuals after the reason for their detention has been resolved, with the excuse of a civil immigration charge. The removal of the need for proof of violation of immigration policy suggests that programs like 287G are doing work beyond the scope of simply enforcing that policy. The author suggests that we thus refuse any easy distinction between the management of territories and the management of populations that they established earlier. Detainment on its own, and the threat of detainment, is doing the work of enforcing territorial boundaries. Immigration enforcement can here be seen as a show of force, the, quote, proving ground for states' territorial integrity. They introduce the concept of immigration incapacitation as a strategy in contrast to assimilation, in that it, quote, doesn't pretend to change anything about people except where they are. This is to say that the message to the public about what the state wants to do with immigrants has shifted from assimilation to incapacitation. You might recall reading in week one Foner's argument that the narrative of the US as a, quote, nation of immigrants is only promulgated by the state when it's politically or economically useful. Immigration enforcement in this way creates an us-them dichotomy without necessarily enforcing an inside-outside. Its function is to create precarity. My most important sentence is regarding this concept of incapacitation. Programs like 287G, which bring the threat of detention and deportation into the most intimate recesses of immigrant life by virtue of the possibility of contact with non federal police, threaten to scatter immigrant subjects into territorially present, yet increasingly invisibilized, shadow populations. In this post 9/11 period, immigration enforcement isn't simply physical expulsion. It involves physical containment, legal exclusion, and other types of displacement, even if that is, quote, within the polis as it's interiorized outside. In summary, deportation in the US isn't simply the physical legal action of removing people from the state. It also functions ideologically as an expression of state power, creation of the immigrant as an other, and disappearance of by means of physical and legal terrorism and precarity. It's a means of social control that extends beyond the actual act. Now, this article is published in the Geographical Journal, which is a UK-based journal published by the Royal Geographical Society. They claim to publish for teachers and pupils in schools, academics and researchers in higher education, professionals and geographers in the workplace, and also members of the public with a curiosity about our world. One critique I'd offer to the authors is the relative lack of explicit discussion of race in the article. The authors only mention race once when discussing, quote, racialized prison populations, and only mention the targeting of Latina populations twice. Otherwise, the racialized aspect of immigration enforcement is only ever alluded to, and never explicitly extended to discuss its impact on other marginalized groups subject to these policing processes. I have posted my discussion questions on the board, so I won't read them in full, but here are my first two. My second two right here. And then here are my references on the slideshow. Thanks so much for your time and patience, y'all. Thank you.